Beneath the stains of time, the feelings disappear. You are someone else. I'm still right here. A line Johnny Cash sang near the end of his life, but it could have been spoken for the suffering that came long before him. Because the truth is, the Trail of Tears didn't begin with a gunshot or a broken treaty. It began with something quieter, something colder, a vote. A single moment of silence inside a marble hall. A moment that set history on a darker path. What became known as the Indian Removal Act of 1830 would come to define an age of expansion, conquest, and loss. Over the next 8 years, that law would drive the forced relocations of more than 60,000 Native people. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole, torn from their homes, their fields, and their graves. For one man, Davy Crockett, it became a line he would not cross. And a century later, Johnny Cash would give that story a voice, low, steady, and carved from regret, singing for an America still wrestling with pride, guilt, and the truth it tried to bury. This episode will tell the story through the people who lived it, the families who walked the 1,000 miles west, the leaders who fought against it, and the voices, past and present, who refused to let it be forgotten. Told in their own words, this is the story of those who bore its cost. Because history is never written by the powerful alone. It's carried by the few who stood against them. I'm Rowan, and this is OTRA Legends. Let's get into it. Davy Crockett, Congressman, frontiersman. They called me the king of the wild frontier. I came up poor on the Nolichucky, scraping bark for shoes and hunting squirrels for supper. What I learned came from the woods and the men who worked them. Out there, a man's word was the only law that mattered. But that didn't matter in Washington. When they brought that bill before Congress in 1830, the one they dressed up as Indian removal, I knew what it meant. Relocation, a word polished clean to hide the dirt beneath. 60,000 people, 5 tribes, 1,000 miles of forced march west of the Mississippi. They'd lose everything. Ancestral burial grounds, farms worked for generations, homes built with their own hands, and they'd have no time. No time to harvest crops or bury their dead. Just soldiers with bayonets and a deadline. I knew Jackson's mercy. I'd seen it. In 1827, I watched the Creek removal. 3,500 souls dead before they reached the other side. And now they wanted to do it again, only bigger. Jackson said the tribes would be safer out west, free from state laws and settlers. But I'd seen the way men talked when they wanted land. They called it providence. They called it destiny. I called it greed. I told them the soldiers would treat them like cattle, keeping them penned up for months before the march. Dysentery would sweep through the camps before the first step west. Families separated at gunpoint. Death tolls in the thousands. I told them this would be a national disgrace we'd never wash clean. They didn't want to hear it. I was raised to fight fair, to tell the truth, and to stand my ground. And by God, I aimed to do it. When the vote came, I stood up and said, no. The bill passed 102 to 97, 5 votes. We nearly had them. Support came mostly from the South. Opposition came from early Whigs in the North and parts of the Upper South. Nearly half of Congress said no. It wasn't a partisan divide. It was a moral one. But my own people back in Tennessee wanted that Cherokee land, and they wanted me to deliver it. I couldn't. I wouldn't. They told me I'd ruined my career. They were right. The 1831 election came, and I lost my seat. Some of the men laughed as I left the chamber. I let them. You cannot argue a man out of his conscience. I told them plain, you may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas. And I did. That was my last honest fight. Not with a rifle, but with my soul. Years later, I'd be dead at the Alamo. But that vote in 1830, that's the one that mattered. Andrew Jackson, President of the United States. I was born poor, orphaned by 13. Everything I had, I carved out with my own hands in a rifle barrel. They called me Old Hickory, hard, unbending, rooted deep. And they weren't wrong. I was born for a storm, and calm never suited me. Peace makes men's soft war made me president. I fought the British, the Spanish, and the Creeks. I bled for this country long before half the men in Congress ever smelled powder. And when I became president, I swore to defend the Union, to secure its borders, to make it strong. Strength demands sacrifice. The Indians had their chance. Washington and Jefferson gave them schools, plows, and scripture. They could have lived among us, learned our ways, some did. Most did not. Now the frontier was bursting. Farmers needed land. The states wanted order. Georgia was threatening to ignore federal authority entirely. I gave them both land and order. I told Congress removal was mercy, that it would protect the tribes from extinction. I called it humanity. I said every effort must be made to avert their calamity. Remove them, and they would live in peace beyond our borders. Refuse, and they would perish here under state laws. They could not escape. Congress agreed. The Indian Removal Act passed in 1830. I signed it into law and appropriated $5 million to see it done right. I believed it then, and belief was enough. The Cherokee resisted. They took their case to the Supreme Court, and in 1832, John Marshall ruled in their favor. He said Georgia had no authority over Cherokee lands. I said, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. The court has no army. I did. Some called me a tyrant for it. Northern preachers sent petitions with thousands of signatures, calling removal a sin against God. Newspapers in Boston and Philadelphia called it systematic destruction. Even men in my own party broke ranks. It did not matter. The treaty was legal enough for me. By 1838, I was out of office, but the work I started was finished. General Winfield Scott deployed 7,000 troops to round up the Cherokee families were given minutes to gather what they could carry. The rest was left for looters. I promised them protection from state laws. Their land was sold before they'd even crossed the border. I promised them compensation. Most claims went unpaid for decades. They say history judges men by their results. Then let it judge me as the man who gave America the room it needed to grow. What it cost, I do not dwell on. History has no patience for regret. John Ross, Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation. I was born between two worlds, the son of a Scottish trader and a Cherokee mother. My name was Gooey's Gooey, the little white bird. I learned the white man's letters before I learned my own language. I believed in the promise of the American word. The weight of ink, the honor of law, I believed it right up until it killed us. We did everything they asked. We built schools, more than 18 by 1825. We established churches. We had our own councils and laws long before the United States. But in 1827, we wrote a constitution modeled on theirs to prove that we could govern ourselves in their way. We lived as they lived because we were told that would keep us safe. But greed is a language older than law. When gold was found on our land in 1829, Georgia came for it. They passed laws stripping us of our rights, forbidding us to testify in court, nullifying our government. They took our homes, our farms, everything we'd built. We turned to the courts. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in Worcester versus Georgia that we were a sovereign nation, that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee lands, that federal treaties protected us. Chief Justice John Marshall himself wrote the decision, but Jackson did nothing. He said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." And so, justice fell silent. I kept fighting, believing reason would prevail. It did not. In May 1838, General Winfield Scott arrived with 7,000 troops. They built stockades at Ross's Landing, Fort Cass, and 11 other locations across Cherokee territory. The soldiers went farm to farm. Families were given minutes, sometimes none, to gather belongings. Everything else was left behind. White settlers followed the troops, looting homes before the families were even out of sight. 16,000 of us held in those stockades through the summer. Measles, dysentery, and whooping cough swept through the camps. Hundreds died before we ever started walking. I tried to hold them together, to believe that decency still lived in the heart of America. But when October came and the drums beat for the march to begin, I saw what mercy meant in this new world. It meant leaving our dead unburied. It meant walking 1,000 miles in winter with no shelter, no food, beyond what the government contracted, and half of that never arrived. It meant watching my wife give her blanket to a child shivering in the snow, only to die herself of pneumonia before we reached Little Rock. I buried her in frozen earth with my own hands. February 1st, 1839. The truth is, the soldiers fed their horses better than the people they guarded. Grandmothers walked through freezing creeks up to their chins. Some called it the Trail of Tears, but others, like Ellis Waterkiller's grandmother, called it the Trail of Death. Some of the Cherokee revolted, killed our guards, and hid in the mountains. They were never found. 4,000 of us died on that road. When they took our land, they said it was for the good of many. When they took our language, they said it was for our salvation. And when they took our children, they said it was for their future. But a promise built on theft will always crumble beneath its own weight. A Cherokee mother in 1838. They came at dawn. Soldiers. Boots on frost. Shouting in a language I did not understand. It was May 26, 1838. General Winfield Scott had given the order 3 days before 7,000 troops spread across Cherokee territory, moving farm to farm. I woke to the sound of my children crying. My husband tried to reason with them in English, the language we were told would save us. They struck him with a rifle butt, then dragged him from the house. We were told to pack what we could carry. They marched us to the stockade at Fort Cass near present-day Charleston, Tennessee. Hundreds of families penned like livestock, no shelter, no privacy. The soldiers watched us from the walls. We stayed there through the summer. Measles came first, then dysentery. The latrines overflowed. The water turned foul. Children died in their mothers' arms, and we had nowhere to bury them properly. By August, over 400 had died in the camps. We had not even started walking yet. In October, they told us it was time. 16,000 Cherokee, divided into 13 detachments. Ours had nearly 1,500 people. We were given wagons for the sick and elderly, but not enough. Most of us walked through Tennessee to Kentucky to Illinois to Missouri to Arkansas to Indian Territory. There was no trail here, only wilderness. A group went ahead to clear trees and brush. We walked for months. We crossed rivers and hollowed logs, slept under ox wagons, burned fence rails for heat. Some days there was food. Most days there was not. The government had contracted suppliers, but half the rations never arrived. What did come was often spoiled. The old fell first, the young soon after. I saw a woman collapse in the snow, her baby too heavy to carry. A soldier took it from her arms and struck it against a tree. The wagons kept moving. My niece carried her fat 4-year-old brother for miles because he could not walk for long and she was afraid they would kill him. Aunt Chin tied her little one on her back with an old shawl, took one child in her arms and led the other by the hand. The 2 larger children died. Somewhere behind us, another mother dug a grave with a broken case knife. There were many unmarked roadside graves, bodies left beneath shrubs or logs. There were mornings when frost grew on our clothes, and nights when the stars looked close enough to touch but gave no warmth. The soldiers would smoke and laugh, and I would count my children again just to be sure they were still there. As we marched through your towns, Hopkinsville, Kentucky, Golconda, Illinois, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, people stood on the street and stared. You stood by and watched our suffering without lending a hand. Some threw rocks, some spat. A few brought bread. I carried my daughter until her body went still. It was somewhere in southern Illinois, near the Mississippi crossing. She had been coughing for days. I thought if I could just keep her warm, keep her moving, she would make it. But she was too light in my arms. I could feel her slipping away even before the breath left her lips. I buried her under a cedar tree and marked the place with stones. I do not remember the name of the town. I do not think I ever knew it. I did not cry. There were no tears left, only the wind and the endless sound of feet. Thousands of us moving west, leaving pieces of ourselves behind with every step. We reached Indian Territory in March 1839. When we reached the new land, there was no welcome party, no food or shelter, only a wilderness of tangled brush and bare hills. The soldiers turned us loose like stray cattle and rode away. We built fires from green wood and made crude shelters. A few took temporary shelter in caves along the creek banks. Others slept beneath their wagons until cabins could be raised from the frozen ground. The soil was poor, red, and hard as iron. The wind carried the sound of crying for weeks after the last wagon passed. We were promised plows and seed, but none came. The government men said it would take time. They called this place Indian Territory, but to us, it was a graveyard. 16,000 began that march. They say 4,000 died, but no one counted the dead. A century later, another man would carry our story with a guitar instead of a rifle, not to celebrate America, but to remind it of its shadow. Johnny Cash, country music artist and actor. They called me the Man in Black because I wore it for the poor and the beaten down. When I first read the story of the Trail of Tears, it wasn't just history. It was a wound that never healed, a grief that felt older than my own voice. I recorded Bitter Tears in 1964, an album of 5 songs about Native people, Apache Tears, The Talking Leaves, As Long as the Grass Shall Grow, songs about broken treaties and the promises a nation buried beneath progress. Radio stations refused to play it. Too political, they said. Too honest. So I took out a full-page ad in Billboard and asked, "Where are your guts?" Years later, when I sang Hurt, people thought it was a song about addiction, but to me, it was a song about consequence, about looking back at what you've built and realizing that what you do in this life matters. I sang, "You can have it all, my empire of dirt," a line fitting for a nation that traded land and lives for its own idea of destiny. I wasn't there when the wagons rolled out of Georgia, but I've driven through those same hills. A song can't change the past, but it can make you feel it. The loss, the silence, the truth that refuses to die. And as long as there's a guitar and someone willing to play it, their names won't be forgotten. Closing reflection. They called it destiny, the march westward, the conquest of wilderness, the fulfillment of God's design. But history tells a different story, of men like Davy Crockett who said no when it mattered, and of a nation that survived what was meant to erase it. The Cherokee removal was only one chapter in a much longer struggle. Decades of wars to drive native nations from their lands had already burned villages, destroyed crops, and spread diseases to which they had no defense. The loss of life, through violence, starvation, and exposure, is greater than any record can measure. What happened on this soil was not just expansion, it was eradication. What we would now call ethnic cleansing. This is their truth. and it is a part of our history. Thanks for joining me on this journey into our past. I'm Rowan, and this is OTRA Legends. Until next time, happy hunting.